and welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, I am your host Muriel, and it's been a little while since I last uploaded a video to my booktube channel. Life happened, basically. I spent almost a month in Ireland for my birthday, and then I've been spending a lot of time over on Twitch, where I play video games, and if you'd like to come and hang out, you're more than welcome. But today, we're back to books. So I will be reviewing a trilogy I read towards the end of August and beginning of the month of September, titled the Gael Song Trilogy, written by Shauna Lawless. Book 1 is The Children of Gods and Fighting Men, Book 2 is The Words of Kings and Prophets, and Book 3 is The Land of the Living and the Dead. Now, I wanted to read this trilogy because it's basically about, well, in part, at any rate, Celtic mythology, and more specifically, Irish mythology. I am a huge mythology nerd, and my favorite body of mythological lore is the Celtic one. So not just Irish one, the Celtic one as a whole, but so this had Irish mythology in it, so I was intrigued, and then I went and looked up some reviews, and things looked promising, although I'm always cautious now with these kinds of books, because I've been burned with, fantasy rooted in mythology or mythological retellings too many times to count at this point. And also, last year, I read The Mermaid Solution, which was also supposed to pull from Celtic and Norse cultures and mythologies, and it was an absolute train wreck, borderline offensive in places, and I DNF'd it halfway through, so I did not want a repeat of that experience. I saw that it was a story told from two female points of view. That is a bonus for me. That it featured quite a bit of historical writing as well, so I was like, oh, okay, that's neat. And then the trilogy is written by an actual Irish woman, which is a massive plus for me at this point as well, because unfortunately, yes, it does matter sometimes. So it was written by an Irish author who clearly did her research, and I love that. In fact, and this is something I did not expect, but which I actually really came to very strongly enjoy, the Gael Song trilogy is basically half historical fiction, half mythological fantasy. So the story is set during the Middle Ages, the early Middle Ages. It spans several years. It goes from about the year 980 AD to 1011 AD, and follows two female characters. One is named Gaula. It is definitely not spelled that way, but that is how it is pronounced. Also, major shout out to the author for including a pronunciation guide for all her characters' names, because Irish phonetics are not always super straightforward. So, Gaula, who was a real person, is the widow of the King of Dublin, and she is a Fomorian, a descendant of the Fomorian race. So it's one of the fantastical races in Irish mythology, and she basically wants to ensure that her son, Sitric, who will become Sitric Silkbeard, inherits the throne of Dublin, and that this will allow her and her brother, who are the last remaining Fomorians, to survive and perhaps then, well, recreate their race with further marriages and further children and things like that. Then we also have Fola. Fola is part of a group of people called the Descendants, and they are descended from the Tuatha De Danann, so another one of the big groups of fantastical peoples from Irish mythology. I mean, a lot of the Irish gods kind of come from that group, that family. So there are like a few hundred of them remaining. They are not the actual Tuatha De Danann, they're the descendants of them, but they still have magical powers. And so she has a sister called Ronat, and her sister is banished because she consorted with a mortal, and that is prohibited in that society. And the leader of the Tuatha De Danann, called Tumas, was Fola's husband. Well, I don't think they got married. No, they're not married, but they were partners. They had a falling out because their child died, because the child was born mortal, and that is a recurring concern with the Descendants, because an increasing number of them are born mortal without magical godly powers. And so there's been a falling out between the two, and Tumas is quite strict, and he banishes Ronat for breaking the rules, whilst Fola was trying to defend him and was basically arguing that the Descendants need to be more flexible with their rules and to integrate. There's a whole recurring conflict with the Descendants either wanting to integrate more with mortals or to retreat from the rest of the world and join the actual Tuatha De Danann back into kind of, the hills and the other world and that whole sphere of existence. And also Ronat is banished because she got pregnant by her mortal lover, and that's a big no-no. So Fola is tasked with taking her son, Brocken, when he's about 4 years old, to go and find a mortal family with which she can place him, because he is basically born mortal. Or is he? Anyway, so she does that. She's also tasked at the same time with spying on a specific group of mortals, because the Descendants have also this whole thing where they keep spies amongst mortals to kind of keep an eye on their affairs and see what's happening. A lot of them basically pass off as Christian monks or nuns, because obviously this is the time period at which, Christianity is really becoming strong in Ireland. Fola goes to, sorry, I forgot the region, I think it's Munster, and goes to the camp of King Brian Boru, who is also very much a real historical figure. And then she eventually settles down there, and the story unfolds. And the trilogy as a whole kind of develops around the ascension of King Brian Boru to the High Kingship of Ireland and his conflict with the Kingdom of Dublin and the Vikings of Dublin. Because if you didn't know, Dublin as a city, the capital city of Ireland, was actually founded by Vikings, not Irish people, or, Gaels. But obviously some of the Irish kings wanted to take it for themselves, and so there is this recurring conflict between the Vikings and the native Gaels of Ireland. And so there is this motif as well of, is conflict the better solution? Should we just, oust the foreign invaders? Or should we try to coexist, intermingle, integrate? And this parallels the conflict between the Fomorians and the two-headed Danann, because that's the other thing Gael very quickly explains. The Fomorians were, well, not fully destroyed by the two-headed Danann. That was kind of their whole thing as well. Their whole, well, maybe not the entire point of their existence, but one of their big tasks was to destroy the Fomorians and rid Ireland of the Fomorians, and they actually think they accomplished this. The two-headed Danann, or their descendants, don't actually realize that there are two Fomorians remaining. So that's also a big narrative driver in this trilogy. So yes, it's a principally dual point of view story. You have Queen Gael on the Fomorian and Viking side, although she herself is actually an Irish princess, and then that of Fola on the two-headed Danann and Gaelic side, although again, she's not even fully a human being because they're descended from the two-headed Danann, a magical, mythological race. That being said, you do get one or two additional points of view in books 2 and 3. The ones that stood out to me were those of Coleman, a cousin of Fola, who is a warrior of the Descendants, and that of Prince Mata, who is the son and heir of King Brian Boru. I think there might have been a couple other points of view, but those are the main secondary points of view besides those of, Gael and Fola. Now, said points of view were written in first person, which I found a little strange at first, because I really would have expected this kind of story to be told in third person, but I didn't really mind it, and I quickly got used to it, so, make of that what you will. It's the kind of story that has pretty straightforward narration. There are flashbacks here and there, and each book, each volume, starts with a prologue. In fact, in book 1, you have the prologue, and then you have an 11-year time jump to the start of the actual story, and then you have an actual time jump between book 2 and book 3, because it does need to cover a decent amount of ground in terms of, historical events. The prose I found good. What I like to call practical, again, I suck at describing prose. It was very efficient prose. It read very smoothly, quite quickly. Nothing really stood out to me in terms of beauty or, I don't know, tons of phrases and things like that, but it was solid prose. It never felt choppy or anything like that. It just allowed me to read these books very easily and very smoothly, and there's something to be said for that. Also, and I already said this, but there is a pronunciation guide for all the names at the beginning of the books. Thank you, strongly appreciated. I don't know what it is about some of the publications I've read concerning Irish folklore and mythology, but there's basically never a pronunciation guide, which I find baffling. The Welsh, as an FYI, 1,000 times better with this. Go Wales for this. Don't know why Irish folklore writers just don't want other people from different cultures to know how to pronounce their own language. Anyway, mini rant over. But so yes, the author included a pronunciation guide for her characters' names. Thank you. I already knew some of them because, well, I've been spending a lot of time in Ireland. And then there are little bits of actual Irish for, common nouns in the story vocabulary that is basically setting and period appropriate. Like there's a ra, so it's R-A-T-H, which was like a little fort, I believe, or like something to do with human habitation, things like that, basically. But still, I appreciated it. And then pacing-wise, the story is semi-slow. I mean, it's not really slow, it's just pretty evenly paced throughout. There's a lot of traveling happening in the stories, there's political intrigue, but then there are also more action-heavy moments because of literal battles that take place. I liked it. I don't know, it was all, rather even, not super fast, not super slow, just even throughout, and that tends to be my preference. The character work, for its part, was actually good. Quite good, honestly, overall, and yes, I suppose first-person writing does help with that, since you spend time in the actual characters' heads and you have immediate access to their thoughts and feelings, so fair enough. More than that, excellent antagonist writing. This story has a great, I don't want to say bad guy is a bit reductive, but an antagonist who was Gola. Gola was a character I freaking hated. But because she was so well written and there is nuance to her personality, you do kind of understand her motivations. You can even somewhat sympathize with them. But I also hated her. I don't think I've hated a character like that since A Song of Ice and Fire. And I say this because she very, very, very strongly reminded me of Cersei Lannister if Cersei Lannister was more intelligent. That is how I would describe Queen Gola. She's a more intelligent, actually more cunning Cersei Lannister type. So that was fun. But yeah, no, I hated her. But that's a compliment with regards to the character writing. So that obviously went for the story's main characters, but pretty much the same applies to all of the secondary characters. No one felt unrealistic. No one felt unhuman, even though they were technically speaking non-human characters, but you know what I mean. It's also really neat that so many of the characters were actually based on real historical figures. So I learned quite a few things there. I mean, obviously not about their actual inner thoughts and feelings, but still the things they did and the events they participated in. And then I somewhat cared, which again, doesn't happen all that easily for me, but I actually cared about some of the characters and I was emotionally invested in what happened to them, so yay! So like I said, this trilogy is essentially half historical fiction and half mythological fantasy, or at least conceptually, but when you actually dig down into it, put more of its skill points into the historical fiction half rather than the mythological fantasy half. There is mythological fantasy in this series, but I wanted a lot more of it. Now yes, the main characters of this trilogy are both members of fantastical, mythological, godly but I'll get back to that. Races. You have Gola, who is a Fomorian, and the Fomorians, well, in this story had access to fire magic, and then you have Fola, who is a descendant of the Tuatha Dé Danann, who have access to, different sorts of magic. The magic using is kind of subdivided into different castes. You have druids, who craft certain kinds of very powerful potions. You have witches, they have access to animal, plant, weather magic. Some of them can also be seers, prophets, and see into the future. That's Ronat's case. Fola herself is a healer, so just magically gifted healers. And then you have the warriors, who are supernatural, warriors, extremely good in combat, good endurance, strength, speed, etc. Then you have the cupbearers, and they can manipulate water. And then you have the harpists, who can manipulate people's emotions with music. Presumably harp music, principally. Was there another one? The smiths, were they the same as the warriors? It doesn't matter all that much, but there's also something to do with, crafting magical items. And there is a lot of referencing of some of the more notorious Tuatha Dé Danann. Lu is name dropped. Is Cuchulainn name dropped? I think he might have been. The Dagda, I think, was mentioned. Okay. I don't think the Morrigan was mentioned. At least I can't remember off the top of my head, but she might have been. Also, the magical items of the two-headed Danon, they had 4 of them. The cauldron is mentioned. There's a spear, I believe, loose spear. There might be a sword. I can't remember. There's a stone. I think there's a stone, cauldron, spear, and then maybe it's a sword. I should be remembering this. I'm very embarrassed that I don't as a mythology nerd. But anyway, so that kind of stuff is referenced, but ultimately the mythological lore is kind of like way off in the background, because you're not even dealing with a two-headed Danon. You're dealing with their descendants, and a lot of them are just born mortal at the point of the story. And then, you know, there aren't any, I don't know, magical creatures or like magical animals like you do have in a lot of Celtic mythology. There's no referencing of some of the events of the cattle raid of Cooley or the Fenian cycle or anything like that. Okay, some of the battles between the two-headed Danon and the Fomorians are mentioned, or at least one of them is, I believe. I think Nuada's silver arm is name dropped as well, but it all happened way in the past. In this story, you have, okay, 2 remaining Fomorians, and they do have very strong, badass, very destructive fire magic, and then a couple hundred descendants who do have access to various different kinds of magic. Although, minor qualm, but like, I was a bit puzzled by the druids. Because here the druids are exclusively descendants of the two-headed Danon, but like, druids were real priests in Celtic cultures. I mean, I know there's this whole thing with druids in like Dungeons and Dragons, and so now, to some people, druid means a special kind of like nature wizard, but druids were actually, they were a priestly caste. So I'm like, were there no just box standard human druids in this version of like Irish history? That was a little confusing to me. And also, it was never made clear in the story whether or not the two-headed Danon were actual gods. I guess they were probably just godlike. And that goes back to an issue I had with the broader religious world building. Because I guess on some level, I wanted something a bit more like the Mists of Avalon with regards to the religious world building and maybe a bit of religious theming. So that brings me back to the historical fiction part of the story. That was honestly really cool, really well done and engaging. I loved learning about early medieval Irish history through the story, because also the author, props to her, she included a bunch of sources in her books afterwards, like if you want to learn more about Brian Boru and, you know, the Viking Kings of Dublin. These are some of the books I used to write my trilogy. So that was really neat. I actually went and looked a lot of this stuff up on my own online, and a lot of the actual events that take place in these books took place in real life. They were actual historical events. A lot of the battles, a lot of the political marriages just straight up happened. I really enjoyed that, but I feel like that it was a bit lacking with the fantasy stuff. And so especially with the religion, that is probably my main bit of criticism with regards to the actual world building blending both. I found that some of the characters had a weirdly out of place modern attitude to faith and religion, given the time period this is set in. Too many characters were just kind of atheist. No, they were just like more atheistic than anything else. And I guess but then that's where it further amplifies my confusion with regards to the two-headed Danon, because Fola, at one point, she has this intimate conversation with Prince Murtaugh, because there is also romance in this trilogy. Not that I mind it in this specific case. And they discuss things like God, and they both seem very jaded about it all. And it's not like I don't believe there weren't any atheists, or even more generally agnostic people in ancient times. But I feel like a lot of that was just also projection on the part of a modern writer onto the past. The fact is, people were, by and large, very religious in the past. They didn't have the kind of understanding about the material world we have today. And even today, you still have very religious people around, even though we have a very good, a much better understanding of material reality. And regardless, I think you can be religious and accept science. So, another discussion, but especially in the past. In the early Middle Ages, people would have been very religious and very superstitious. And you just have too many characters who are kind of a bit flippant about it. And just like, and fine, they've seen war and they've seen death and suffering. So what? People still believed in God. Something about that really felt off to me. It felt anachronistic, basically, especially once again, considering the fact you had a character who was herself a descendant of the two-headed Danon, but then again, it was never made clear whether or not they were actual gods. I was a bit frustrated with all of that. I'm like, okay, but you yourself are basically immortal. Although technically speaking, the descendants weren't actually immortal in the text. They just lived very long lives, around 400 years? Kind of like the Numenorians in the Legendarium. But still, I don't know, something with that just didn't quite add up. Again, I think I would have preferred something more akin to the Mists of Avalon, which for its part deals with the Arthurian mythos and I guess, yeah, Celtic mythology and lore more on the British side of things. I would prefer something like that, where the numinous is, in fact, present in the story, although you don't actually have an encounter with gods, nothing so overt and crass in a way. But the sacred, the numinous, is very much real, and it is certainly real to the people in the story. And it's also a story that takes place basically in the early Middle Ages, although slightly earlier than 900 to 1000 AD. But like, again, 900 to 1000 AD in Ireland, a bastion of Christianity until rather recently too. And you have all these characters who just like, God, maybe, I don't know, is it a thing? Like, no, that didn't really pass my sniff test. And I guess, yeah, because of the Mists of Avalon, I would have liked something a bit more prominent in terms of theming around religion as well, around religious transitions, because again, we're talking about, you know, Christian Ireland, but then you have these descendants of the Tuatha Dé Danann, and you have Fomorans bopping about, and you get hints that they're still not actual pagans, but people with pagan practices out in the countryside. I would have liked theming around that, the kind of sometimes violent or just conflictual transition between, you know, pre-Christian Ireland and Christian Ireland, and how the mythological characters kind of feel about all of that. I would have liked more of that. When you have literal descendants of maybe gods from pagan Ireland, and then they're just passing off as monks and nuns, and they don't really comment on that at all. Yeah. That could have been done better, most definitely. And interestingly, it kind of reminded me of a similar problem I encountered in a book I read, again, a year ago now? More than a year ago. Titled Inanna, which was meant to be a mythological retelling of the Epic of Gilgamesh, kinda, with bits of the descent of Inanna into hell. So that's more Sumerian mythology, which is another canon mythology that I really enjoy. And Inanna Ishtar is one of my favorite goddesses. And there the gods are definitely not actual gods, and they might even be aliens. And did I hate that in that book. It's not as bad in the Gael Song trilogy, to be very clear, but the cynicism of it all, the kind of irony pilling of it all was just a bit, no, I don't want that freaking early medieval historical fantasy. Now, I am a little sad to say I didn't really get much in terms of deeper theming with this trilogy, which, yeah. No, it did disappoint me. Again, that whole thing with the religious world-building and the lack of religious theming, not to my personal preference. That being said, I still enjoyed the story as it was, and it's not like there was nothing there. So I guess there was a little bit about the passing of ages. I mean, like I said, there's kind of this running motif of conflict between the native Gaels of Ireland and then the Viking settlers of Dublin, and then Limerick was also said to be a Viking settlement. As one of the cities of Ireland, but it was also, I guess, founded by Vikings. So you have the conflict between those two cultures, and, well, the question is posed, wouldn't it be better if everyone tried to get along and integrate and intermingle, and there are things we could learn from each other, and with intermarriages, etc., etc. There's definitely something there with that, and again, it parallels a similar thing, although that's more speculative on my part at the point of this story. There might be a similar thing happening between the Fomorans and the Tuatha Dé Danann. But so yes, a passing of ages, and wouldn't it be better, in fact, to just accept these new people into our cultural makeup? And it also goes to show that even back then, so going back to the 10th century, what we think of as, you know, national identities and cultural identities, or at least those that exist today, they're made up of a lot of different elements. Irish people of today have Viking ancestry, basically. I mean, there are a lot of, I was going to say Irish DNA, I know what I mean, but like, when you look at genomic studies of the people of Iceland, there's a lot of Irish in there, because a lot of the Viking settlers that went to Iceland, they took brides from the UK and Ireland with them, and so that went into the makeup of the people of Iceland, even though it was primarily a Norse culture with the Norse language, they still had Irish in there. Well, in Ireland, you have a bunch of Viking. The capital city of Ireland today was originally a Viking city. So I like the way this trilogy kind of just showed all of that without any specifically pointed commentary. It doesn't really try to hammer a message into your head about it, but it just kind of shows that that's what happened. That's just kind of the reality of how cultures and civilizations form and evolve over time, and I thought that was well done. But still, yeah, I would have liked just more in terms of theming, in terms of something I could actually chew into and analyze, especially given the potential afforded by setting this story in the 10th and, well, beginning of 11th centuries with characters that would have, well, that are descended from beings that would have been there in Ireland before Christianity came to the island. And yeah, again, I just wanted, I guess I just wanted the Irish version of the Mist of Babylon, and that's never what that was going to be. So fair enough, but it is what I would have preferred. And given the fact that's what I probably would have preferred, I must concede that I probably would have preferred a story set even earlier in the Middle Ages, around the time when, you know, St. Patrick came over to Ireland. Basically around the time the Mist of Babylon actually takes place. I think I would have liked a story set in that time period to actually examine the transition from paganism to Christianity. Not that you can necessarily make it super historically accurate, because the further back you go in history, the harder it is to actually state things as having happened for certain, especially with Celtic religion and paganism. We know actually very, very little about it, besides some bits, you know, given to us by the Romans or then passed down by later Christian monks, and then obviously there's a lens through which they retold those old stories, and so that makes it all more complicated. I mean, it's not impossible, it's not like there's nothing, but there isn't that much, unfortunately. But that creates a great opportunity for historical fantasy. So yeah, I probably would have preferred something set a bit earlier, a different kind of story, but again, I really enjoyed this trilogy. The blend of fantasy and historical fiction was very engaging. Again, I wanted a bit more of the fantasy front proper, but at least it was a great way for me to get a bit of historical education on medieval Ireland. And also, that's always something I value. It made me care. The story made me care. I actually cared about the stakes. I cared about the characters. I shed a few tears at the end of book 3. I was taken in about what happened to the characters, and there wasn't that much symbolism, but the stuff that happened involving life, death, the other world. I mean, the third book is titled The Land of the Living and the Dead. Though again, you could do a lot more with the actual Irish mythology around that, but opportunity for future books. And I say this because, so this is actually a first trilogy in a greater series. And the author released the first book in the sequel trilogy this year? Tail end of last year? It's like super recent, because I mean, yeah, the first book in the Gael trilogy was published in 2022, so it's a very recent series. And there is now a book 1 to a sequel trilogy, which I might check out at some point. I'm not writing it off. I enjoyed the first one enough that I wouldn't mind spending more time in this version of our world. Yeah, I mean, that's what it is, as a historical fantasy. So, I mean, you can kind of tell there's room for more storytelling in this world. When you get to the end of book 3, it's kind of like, oh, well, okay, yeah. Yeah. To be clear, you can't absolutely just leave it off at the end of book 3. The story told in the Gael trilogy is concluded satisfyingly by the end of book 3, but there's definitely room. Like, you can see, oh, right, okay, there's a sequel trilogy, that makes sense, I can totally see why. But you can also just have a satisfying story with the first 3 books and leave it there. I think that works fine as well. But I'll probably check out the new trilogy at some point. Maybe next year, or maybe I'll wait until all 3 books are published. I'll see. And so I would, yes, fully recommend this one if you want historical fantasy. When again, you want historical fantasy, read The Mist of Babylon. I will never not recommend that, but that is my favorite standalone fantasy novel of all time, so it's very hard to beat that. But you want something more recent, and you want something that deals with Irish, Celtic mythology, at least in part, and which will actually give you story events based in real life historical events. You want to learn a bit about early medieval Irish history in a way that's fun and flavored with a bit of spicy fantasy. I would very much recommend you pick this trilogy up. For me, it was a very strong, like for the entire trilogy, it was a very strong 7 out of 10. 7 to 7.5, but at the very least, a very strong, solid, good 7 out of 10. Definitely worth my time. And again, probably worth my time to check out the sequel trilogy, but we'll see. I guess I'll report back at some point. Probably. And on that final note, I hope you found this review interesting, engaging, entertaining, just a chill, pleasant way to pass the time. You know, all the usual good things. If you've read the trilogy and want to share thoughts and feelings, please feel free to do so in the comments down below. I hope you'll have a lovely day, evening, or whichever time of day you prefer. Do take good care of yourselves, and thank you for watching. And once again, if you want to come and hang out on Twitch, you're more than welcome to do so. But so yes, I shall see you all at some point in the next video. But until then, bye-bye!